Is justice really blind? Or do we live in a two-tiered justice system that judges its citizens based on their gender rather than the crime they have committed? What is the penalty for a teacher who has sex with a student? In America, most schools have eliminated their sexual education courses as being too obtrusive into the lives of students. These classes were meant to prepare students for the eventuality of having sex. But there was no eventuality for them having sex with their own teachers. Tonight, on Predator 101, we discuss a justice system based upon gender. We hire teachers to mold our children's minds and to keep the relationship with them above the belt and purely platonic. Most teachers can't find the time between creating a winning lesson plan and grading homework, but some find the time to have sex with their students. The following are two examples of such teachers. First off, you have Mrs. Lauren Barclay, age 27. She chose to have sex with her 17-year-old male student. And our next teacher, Miss Cara LaBosse, age 32 years. She chose to have sex with two 14-year-old girl students. Hello, and welcome to Predator 101. Today on Predator 101, we asked the question, did the judge apply the law fairly in the cases of two female teachers who got probation over jail time for having sex with their underage students? Now, not only were the actions horrendous enough for having sex with minors by virtue of age, but I believe made worse for the teacher's authority over that age. And just about any school within any district you can care to name has an explicit policy forbidding teachers and staff from engaging in any relationship beyond that of teaching or mentoring the student. It doesn't ask for anything else. By law, once a teacher is assigned to a school, he or she must be familiarized in the following statements concerning inappropriate behaviors with the child, which roughly states, and I quote, an improper relationship that with the student can result in criminal conviction, imprisonment, and financial penalties. Even if the relationship is consensual, an improper sexual act between teacher and student is illegal. It is illegal in the sense that the teacher is in a position of authority over the child. Now, if one can imagine it wrong for your boss at work to sexually harass you or rape you against your will, then you can understand the same applies to teachers. You see, your employer being in a position over you governs your emotional state to that job and the world as a whole. Now, the abuse of trust law is currently limited to certain regulated settings and positions. These include education and care settings, clinics, hospitals, voluntary children's homes, residential family centers, and criminal justice settings. So it covers teachers, social workers, and doctors, for example. So it matters not what you hear from the mouth of the teacher in defense of herself in this case. Now, because most of these statements are to play on the hearts and minds of the judge and jury if it goes to trial. Now, additionally, the teacher tries to hide behind the fact that she is a female and a vulnerable member of society when she needs to be. Now, she seeks to get your mind off of the fact that she was charged in protecting, in fact, defending members of society that were more vulnerable than she or the student. So after being advised of these regulations that I told you about a minute ago, and their rights as teachers in a jury trial, they are not done yet. You see, the teacher is then tasked to review a written version of those same rules, rights, and regulations that they were just apprised of, and then sign them in a written statement. So before we get pulled deep into the shared fantasy by the offending teacher of believing that, hey, maybe she didn't mean to do it, or hey, maybe she was going through a low point in her life, a low point in her marriage, or any excuse we can lend to a female teacher, something we would not to a male teacher. We must first understand this. This teacher has risked her career, her marriage in many cases, her freedom from jail, her reputation in her community, and bringing shame to her own children and extended family members. That's just a start. Now, if you can find an excuse for her after all of those things and advance warnings that I just gave you, then you got my vote. You see, now to our first case, which comes to us from Orland Park, Illinois, where a teacher and basketball coach from Gerling Junior High School was charged with grooming, then molesting two young female students. The teacher pounced on a moment to gain the girls' trust at a time that they were going through a personal tragedy at home, a very personal tragedy in their life. You see, those two young ladies' father had recently committed suicide, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this to be the ex-basketball coach was the perfect time to swoop in and put the moves on two girls who were given the permission to have a sleepover at her house, since they were trusted by her. You see, the sleepover would give them much needed space from their own home, which carried too many recent memories and the baggage trauma of their father's early demise. Miss LaBus first met her victims when she was their basketball coach at Gerling Junior High School in Orland Park. The sexual abuse took place between the year 2008, when the girls were 14, to 2014, when they were finally able to gather enough willpower to report that crime. Miss LaBus, when it came to the sisters, ultimately exchanged their trust for molestation, and in court, her very lengthy prison sentence for a very sweet deal of 24 months of probation. Mrs. Carol LaBus, 32 years of age, was arrested in January of 2015 and accused of abusing two young girls between the ages of 14 and 16 while she was a teacher and a basketball coach at school. She was initially charged with 4 counts, ladies and gentlemen, 4 counts of aggravated criminal sexual abuse. For the past 5 years, Miss LaBus has been under electronic home monitoring, an alternative to jail. LaBus was credited with 2,141 days of monitoring, according to the court. Now, after that, Miss LaBus, due to COVID regulations, appeared virtually in court, where the Circuit Court Judge Kerry M. Kennedy agreed to amend the charges on behalf of the state judge. Now, the state judge negotiated an agreement to lessen the charge to aggravated battery. Now, with aggravated battery, she got a 24-month sex offender probation. The assistant state attorney said the decision came as Miss LaBus had no criminal background prior to the sexual abuse allegations. It was also deemed that the former teacher did not have to register as a sex offender. She's doing pretty good, right? Now, LaBus pleaded guilty to the aggravated battery charges and also agreed to give up her right to trial before a judge, or to hear the witnesses testify against her and explain her version of the story. Now, Judge Kennedy said that if LaBus violates her probation, she could face a year mandatory supervised release similar to parole, and also be fined up to $25,000. Ooh, now that's tough, right? Not really. The judge had these further words to impart to the former teacher. He said, and I quote, "You are a predator. You definitely took advantage of these two young ladies. They're 14 years of age and suffering from the loss of their father, and you just took advantage of it." Kennedy told Miss LaBus in court, "You're on my probation now, and I'm sure your attorney, Miss Moore, explained to you how seriously I take probation." He said, "You do not want to be back in front of me on a violation," end quote. But it still is not a real sentence for a crime that she did. Cook County Judge Kerry Kennedy called the case one of the worst he dealt with, and wanted Carol LaBus he warned her that she wouldn't want to be back in front of him for violating her probation. Now, Miss LaBus, once again, he said, "You are a predator," the judge said bluntly after LaBus pleaded guilty to 2 counts of aggravated battery. LaBus, 36, spoke softly and one-word answers when questioned during the online hearing, but she declined to make any statements. Statements read in court from the victims now, that was something different. So they both had a chance to make statements against her. So like I said, statements read in court from the victims accused LaBus of ruining their childhood and scarring them for life. The first victim statements read as follows, and I quote, she is a manipulative liar, mentally, physically, and emotional abuser. But she is a child sex offender, a pedophile," adding that they struggle with depression, anxiety, anorexia, and substance abuse during their high school and college careers. Now, she goes on to say, I have a hard time trusting people now, and I have felt suicidal during the hardest times. A teacher and a coach is supposed to protect kids, not abuse them. The victim continued on by saying, I feel at peace knowing children will be protected in the future from Carl's abuse. She is a danger to kids and a disgrace to society. Carl, you may have knocked me down, the student said, but you didn't break me, and I am not a victim. I am a survivor. End quote. Now, the second victim's statement read in court accused LaBus of taking advantage of them for being vulnerable after losing their father to suicide. The victim also said she suffered from disturbing flashbacks. Can you imagine? If everybody said people enjoy having sex with a teacher, she's suffering flashbacks. She goes on to say, and I quote, I actually thought you cared and wanted to help our family move forward during that difficult time. But I know now you were only there to target your next victims. The victim's statement read, you are a sick sociopath who has no real or true emotions and feelings. I do not know how many victims there are, but one thing I do know, and that is that you did not silence me. I will do everything in my power to protect any little boys and little girls from you. She goes on to say, you destroyed my childhood. End quote. Now after this, when Judge Kennedy asked LaBus if she had any comments, she declined. The mother of the victims now, that was even worse. She told Patch she believes LaBus did not get the sentence she deserves. She then went on to say, I think a life sentence. I think a death sentence is what she get. The mother said. She said, my husband just committed suicide. I thought she was a teacher helping me. She manipulated the girls and drew them apart from me at a time we needed to be closer together. She destroyed their lives, and I'm just so proud of my girls for being strong. Now, the victim's attorney said his clients may not have gotten all of what they had hoped for in this case, but that they got the most important thing to them. And it was that the former teacher admitted to the conduct rather than just a stipulation. She admitted in open court on the record that that's the conduct she engaged in was abhorrent, and for my clients, that was as important as anything else. Now, it had been so many years, my clients just really had a desire to get closure and put this behind them. And that, what this plea agreement took care of. Justice, the lady said, is justice denied. So we move on to our next case. And it's similar to the first. Like I said, and now to our second case of a teacher who had sex with her student and yet received the similar sweetheart deal as sentencing for doing so. Now don't get me wrong. I do believe that if a person makes amends in life for a wrong they have committed, they should be forgiven. But the way these female teachers get off in court is nothing short of a Vatican churches called the Sacrament of Penance. Now, the Sacrament of Penance, it absolves you of your sins. In short, the judge waved his hands in front of the defendant and said, your sins are forgiven, my child. Now, she must have been forgiven by the church because she too got a sweetheart deal only after admitting to having sex with students in that park that day. But all you have to do is admit it and you get off. So the teacher's name? Miss Lauren Barclay, 27 years of age, a former substitute teacher in Missouri, had been sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation on a reduced charge of harassment of a person under the age of 17. Now, before you allow yourself to get pulled into the attractiveness of this young teacher, let me give you a true story of how attractiveness kills. The educational setting for teachers has always provided a ready pool of victims for sexual deviancy. In any educational setting around campus, most anyone would not see Mr. Ted Bundy was befitting the traditional male image of a rapist who grooms his victims. But he was. For Mr. Ted Bundy would go down in the history of the United States as the most attractive serial killer. Bundy, just like the teachers we are talking about today, used his looks and charismatic traits that he would exploit to win the trust of victims and society. He would typically approach his victims in public places, feigning injury or disability, or impersonating any authority figure before knocking them unconscious and taking them to secluded locations to rape and strangle them. Mr. Bundy sometimes revisited his victims' bodies after death, grooming and performing sexual acts. He did this with decomposing corpses until the putrefaction and destruction by wild animals made any further interaction impossible. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept some of the severed heads as mementos in his apartment. In his reign of impersonating teachers on campus, Mr. Bundy ultimately killed 30 girls and women. Now, surely these female teachers don't approach his level of insanity, but they do prey on their students and the public's sympathies with their looks, as Bundy did. Just as in the case with Ted Bundy, it was hard to get females on the jury that could imagine him doing such things. In fact, as he was behind bars, he had several offers for marriage and female pen pals that fell in love with his looks. So I encourage you to rethink any silly notion that these teachers are either attractive or that maybe the student was lucky. Now, let us return to the case at hand. Now, People reports Barclay was originally charged with felony sexual contact with a student. The charge would have gotten her ladies and gentlemen, 3 years in prison, but she was given a lighter sentence as a part of a plea deal, an agreement she reached after admitting to engaging in sexual relationships with one of her students, not rape. Now, she will now be required to comply with sex offender registration and avoid any contact with the student and his family. This is what they put in every case. But this was not her policy before the court, because from November of 2016 to January of 2017, Miss Barclay, who was 24 years old at the time, had sex with her then 17-year-old student twice, in addition to giving him oral sex while in a car at the park. The student also confirms that this encounter took place. Now, Monette City Police Officer and the school's resource officer, Jay Justel, filed a probable cause report back in April of 2017 after receiving an anonymous tip suggesting that Miss Barclay was possibly having sex with this one student. 1 week later, Justel was able to speak to the victim, who admitted to having intercourse with Barclay on multiple occasions, recalling 2 incidents in his parents' home, as well as an incident in the park where she gave him oral sex. Now, when police officer Justel confronted Barclay about these allegations, she became forward with what she called an inappropriate relationship with her student, not that she raped him. She was fired the same day that the probate cause report was filed for admitting her sex crimes. Now, for admitting sex crime, Ms. Barclay, the former Monette, she was called a paraprofessional. She pleaded guilty to a lower felony stemming from the sexual contact with a student charged and filed in 2017. Now, Ms. Lauren Barclay, 27, formerly now a Monet teacher, pleaded guilty to harassment against a person younger than 17 years old, which is a Class D felony. Now, in the state of Missouri, a Class D felony is the next lowest class of felonies that one could be charged with. A Class D felony in Missouri is punishable by up to 7 years in prison or 1 year in county jail. The court also can impose a fine up to $10,000. Now, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, suspended in lieu of 5 years supervised probation handed down by a special judge in the case, Jasper County Judge David B. Mountain. Now, per the plea agreement, Barclay, who now lives in a town called Purcell, Oklahoma, is required to comply with sex offender registration while on supervised probation. She's required to be supervised by discretion of a sex offender program and is prohibited, ladies and gentlemen, prohibited from having any contact with the victim or victim's family as usual. The state also agreed to dismiss the Lawrence County case against Barclay now, because originally she was charged with 4 counts of sexual contact with a student by a teacher, 2 counts each in Barry and Lawrence counties. Now, Barclay was first hired as a substitute teacher in the fall semester of 2016. And that November, she was hired as a paraprofessional in that school. She began her teaching assistant role in January 2017 and was relieved of her duties on April 2017. Now, How can you start a job in January, mess up by April, and get kicked out of a school system? Did you not start with the intention of having sex with him? So tune in next week when we bring you another one of these cases and see if you can understand why this happens. Not just in a school system where up to 80% of the teachers are female, but where we let a difference go. When the male commits a crime like this, we send him to prison. Everybody suggests he should be hanged. He should be given a chair. He should be in prison for life. As a matter of fact, when you arrest him and put him in jail, prisoners beat up on him for doing that to a child. And some prisoners may rape him for doing that to a child. They're committing the crime on him that they said he shouldn't do. So tune in next week for Predator 101 and have a marvelous day. And watch out. Don't let your teacher get you.